His wife threw sweet tea in his face in front of 40 people and called him a nobody. And he let her. He stood there, dripping, surrounded by her family's laughter, and did the one thing none of them expected, nothing. No raised voice, no defense, no explanation. Just a quiet hand reaching into his pocket for his phone, a few tapped words on a screen, and a calm walk to the bathroom to clean himself up. To everyone in that backyard, that stillness looked like weakness. It looked like a man who had accepted his place at the bottom of a family that had never once respected him. What they did not know, what his wife did not know, what her brother did not know, what her mother had spent 8 years being absolutely certain she knew, was that the man they were laughing at had already built the largest private infrastructure empire in the Western Hemisphere. $5.3 trillion, built quietly, built deliberately, and built in a way that meant every dollar of status that family had ever spent was, unknowingly, his. The question is not what he had, the question is what he decided to do with it, and how completely their world came apart when he did. If you are the kind of person who believes that patience is not weakness, that some people simply wait until the moment is right, then hit that like button right now, because this story was made for you. Subscribe if you are new here, because we tell stories like this every single week. And drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Let us know. Now let me take you all the way back to a Sunday afternoon in Germantown, Tennessee, where a backyard full of people were about to make the most expensive mistake of their lives, and only one person in that yard already knew it. The Caldwell estate sat on 2.5 acres in Germantown, and every inch of it had been arranged to remind you of exactly who owned it. The lawn was cut in diagonal stripes. The catering tent was white with gold trim. There were attendants, actual attendants, stationed near the drink tables in pressed black shirts, and the playlist coming through the outdoor speakers was the kind of smooth jazz that announced itself as a lifestyle choice. 40-some people moved through the yard in their best summer clothes, the women in linen and wedge heels, the men in linen shirts with the top 2 buttons open, and all of it together created the particular atmosphere of a black family that had decided collectively that they had arrived. Calvin Reese pulled his 2011 Honda Accord through the gate at noon and found a parking spot near the back behind a catering van. He sat in the car for a moment, not from hesitation, not from dread, just from the particular stillness of a man who has learned to take a breath before walking into a room that has never made him feel welcome. He had barely stepped onto the grass when Phyllis Caldwell materialized at his side, appearing the way she always did, as if she had been positioned there in advance. She wore cream linen and a smile that stopped precisely at her cheekbones. "Calvin," she said, "I wasn't sure you were coming." She paused just long enough for the implication to settle. "Jasmine mentioned you had things to catch up on." "Work things." The word work came out the way you might say hobby. "We're just glad she didn't have to come alone." Calvin said, "Good afternoon, Phyllis," and kept moving. He had not been at the food table for 4 minutes when Terence Caldwell made his entrance. The Bentley Continental came through the gate with the particular slowness of a car whose driver wants to be watched, and the yard obliged. Heads turned. Someone said something appreciative. Terence stepped out in a white linen suit and burgundy loafers, and the yard received him the way it always did, like a man who had done something worth celebrating by simply showing up. Terence was Jasmine's older brother and the CEO of Caldwell Financial Group, and he carried both titles the way some men carry a weapon, openly, and with the constant suggestion that he was willing to use them. He was broad and loud and handsome, in the aggressive way of a man who has been told so since childhood, and he moved through the yard with the loose confidence of someone who has never once doubted the room's opinion of him. He spotted Calvin at the food table and smiled. "Calvin Reese," he said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of cousins to hear. "Still pushing that accord, I see." Calvin put a spoonful of potato salad on his plate. "It runs," Calvin said. Terence laughed, the big laugh, the crowd laugh, and someone nearby laughed with him. He reached past Calvin for a plate, taking his time, filling the space. "I've been meaning to ask you something. Every year I see you at this thing, and every year I wonder." He paused for effect. "What is it you actually do, man? Like, for real?" "Finance," Calvin said. "Infrastructure investment." Terence's smile sharpened. "Infrastructure." He repeated the word slowly, like he was tasting it for the joke inside it. All right. So what have you built? You're always talking about projects. Name one thing, one real thing." The yard had gotten quieter around them. It happened the way it always happened. Gradually, then all at once, the conversations tapering till the people nearby were no longer pretending not to listen. Calvin looked at Terence. "I've been working on something significant," he said. "A large project. It's at a stage I'm not able to discuss publicly." The laugh that came out of Terence was the loudest yet. "You hear this?" He turned to address the yard directly now, making witnesses of everyone. "Significant. Can't discuss it publicly." He shook his head with theatrical pity. "Calvin, you've been saying that for 8 years. Jasmine's been saying it for 8 years. He spread his hands. There's no project. There's no empire. There's a man who does people's taxes and drives a 12-year-old car and comes to our family reunion every year and pretends. 40 people were watching. Jasmine was standing 11 feet away near the drink table in a yellow sundress with her hair pinned up, and Calvin looked at her the way he always did in these moments, with the specific hope that this time would be different. It wasn't. She laughed first. It was a small laugh, almost involuntary, the kind that escapes before better judgment can stop it. But it was enough. It gave the yard permission. And then she reached down, picked up the glass of sweet tea sitting on the table beside her, and walked toward him. "Stop it, Calvin." Her voice was bright and final. "Stop pretending you're in our league." She threw the tea directly into his face. The glass was nearly full. It hit him across the cheek and the collar and soaked into his shirt in a spreading brown stain, and the yard went electric. Gasps and stunned laughter, and the specific hiss of people who know they are watching something they will talk about for years. "You are an accountant," she said, loud and clear, performing it now. "A little invisible. Nobody accountant." Calvin did not move. He stood there with tea dripping from his jaw and did not raise his voice, did not step toward her, did not change his expression in any way that the yard could read. He simply reached into his shirt pocket and took out his phone. He looked at the screen. He typed 3 words with his thumb and put the phone away. Behind Jasmine, close enough to have seen the screen clearly, Dorothy Caldwell stood very still. She was 78 years old and had been a 4th-grade teacher for 31 years, and she had spent a lifetime learning how to read what people were not saying. She had seen the subject line on Calvin's screen before he could turn the phone away. It read, Federal Grid Contract, 2.1T awarded. Dorothy did not say anything. She set her plate down on the table beside her, very carefully, and walked to a lawn chair at the far edge of the yard. She sat down. She did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. She simply watched Calvin. Calvin excused himself quietly and walked to the house. The bathroom was at the end of the first-floor hallway, and it smelled like the cedar candles Phyllis kept in every room. He ran the cold water and pressed a folded paper towel against his collar. He looked at himself in the mirror above the sink. The damp shirt, the jaw still faintly sticky, the calm face of a man who has absorbed this specific kind of weather so many times that it no longer surprises him. He looked at himself for a long moment, and then something behind his eyes settled into a place it had never quite reached before. He had made a decision. But to understand what that decision meant, to understand the full weight of what Calvin Reese was holding in his hands when he walked out of that bathroom, you have to go back 14 years to a spare bedroom in Orange Mound, to a man sitting alone at a folding table with a laptop and $200,000 and a name he had not yet told anyone. Calvin Reese grew up on Delmar Avenue in Orange Mound in a house that was small enough that you could hear every conversation through the walls and big enough to hold everything that mattered. His father, Clifton Reese, drove a postal route for 31 years and never once called in sick. His mother, Ruth, worked the night shift as a licensed practical nurse at Methodist Hospital until her knees gave out, and then she worked the day shift instead. They were not wealthy people. They were something better than that. They were disciplined, and they were patient, and they believed with a certainty that bordered on the theological that if you built something carefully enough, it would last. Calvin was their only child, and he absorbed that belief the way he absorbed everything else in that house. Quietly, completely, and without announcement. He was the first in his family to earn a 4-year degree. Finance from the University of Memphis, class of 2005. He wore a rented gown to graduation because Clifton said buying one for a single morning was wasteful. Ruth cried anyway. She always said Calvin had a mind that worked like a long game, always 3 moves ahead, never in a hurry. She was not wrong. By 2009, Calvin had spent 4 years working for a regional accounting firm, learning the architecture of money the way a carpenter learns wood, from the grain out. He had watched infrastructure deals get structured and restructured, had seen how municipal contracts moved, had identified a gap in the market that the big firms were too slow and too arrogant to fill. Smaller cities, rural broadband, federal energy grid expansion, the boring work, the invisible work, the work that held the country together while everyone else chased the flashier numbers. He went to his parents one Sunday after church, sat at their kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and explained what he wanted to do. Clifton listened without interrupting. Ruth refilled his coffee twice. When Calvin finished, Clifton looked at Ruth, and Ruth looked at Calvin, and she said, "How much do you need?" $200,000, every dollar they had set aside over 30 years of disciplined saving. They gave it to him without a contract, without conditions, and without a single moment of hesitation. 2 weeks later, Calvin filed Reese Capital Infrastructure in the state of Delaware under a registered trade name that did not contain his full name. He set up his first office in the spare bedroom of his apartment on Airways Boulevard. A folding table, a laptop, a printer, and a whiteboard he bought from an office surplus store for $40. He worked for 14 months before he landed his first real contract. A municipal broadband expansion in rural Arkansas, 3 counties, federal subsidy-backed, worth $4.2 million over 3 years. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing anyone would read about. But it was real, and it was his, and he executed it without a single missed deadline. He reinvested everything. By 2011, Reese Capital had 6 contracts and 12 employees, all of them believing they worked for a mid-sized infrastructure consulting firm with a quiet founder who preferred email to meetings. By 2012, the firm had crossed $100 million in managed project value and Calvin had quietly begun building the subsidiary structure that would eventually shield everything. Meridian Bond Partners, Reese Infrastructure Holdings, a network of Delaware and Wyoming entities that kept the parent company invisible to anyone who did not already know where to look. It was also in 2012 that he met Jasmine Caldwell. The fundraiser was at Greater Harvest Baptist Church, the kind of event where everyone came dressed like they were being evaluated because they were. Jasmine was working the registration table in a cream blazer and pearl earrings, and she was the most polished woman in the room, and she knew it. She smiled at Calvin when he walked up, and the smile was warm and real and entirely strategic, all at once. They dated for 7 months. She was charming in the way of someone who has been taught that charm is a tool, and Calvin was steady in the way of someone who does not need to perform anything. She found his quietness intriguing at first. Later, she would find it suspicious. Later still, she would find it contemptible. He asked her to marry him in December of that year at his parents' kitchen table, with Ruth's sweet potato pie on the counter and Clifton's gospel station playing low on the radio. Jasmine said yes, and she looked around that kitchen with an expression she thought she was hiding. The wedding was small, 30 people at a church hall Calvin paid for in cash. Phyllis Caldwell stood near the reception table in a mother-of-the-bride suit that cost more than Calvin's monthly rent, and she told 3 separate guests that she had hoped for something more substantial. She said it quietly. She always did everything quietly. But Calvin heard it. He said nothing. In the years that followed, his silence became its own kind of room that Jasmine filled with assumptions. He worked from a home office some days and a satellite space in East Memphis others, and when she asked what he was doing, he said consulting. When she pressed, he said infrastructure. When she lost interest, which was quickly, he went back to work. She never visited the East Memphis office. Not once in 8 years. By 2016, Reese Capital Infrastructure had crossed $10 billion in managed infrastructure assets across 22 states. Calvin had 200 employees who called him Mr. R. He had federal contracts that touched the daily lives of millions of people who had never heard his name. And his wife had told her book club just that spring that her husband handled taxes for small businesses. She believed it completely. That was the thing about Jasmine Caldwell. She had never once been curious enough about Calvin Reese to discover who he actually was. And while she was busy deciding what he wasn't, he kept building everything she couldn't imagine. But the Caldwell family had their own story running parallel to Calvin's, and that story was not nearly as solid as they wanted the world to believe. Caldwell Financial Group had been the family's religion long before it was their business. Bernard Caldwell founded it in 1991 out of a 2-room office on Winchester Road with a single administrative assistant, a fax machine, and the kind of conviction that only comes from being told your entire life that people like you do not build things like this. He had built it anyway. 30 years of careful client cultivation, conservative portfolio management, and a reputation in Memphis's black professional community as a firm that could be trusted with generational money. By 2016, Caldwell Financial managed $2.2 billion in client assets. It had 43 employees and a glass-fronted headquarters in East Memphis, and its name on a plaque at 3 different community organizations. It was also, quietly and completely, on the edge of collapse. Bernard was the only one who knew. He had carried the knowledge the way old men carry their worst secrets, alone, upright, without complaint. A series of aggressive bond positions in 2014 and 2015 had gone wrong in the way that conservative firms were never supposed to let things go wrong, and by the spring of 2016, Caldwell Financial had a $340 million liability gap, a regulatory exposure that was 60 days from becoming public, and no realistic path to survival without an immediate capital infusion that Bernard had no idea how to source. He called Calvin on a Tuesday evening in April. Not Terence, not Jasmine, not a single one of the Caldwell cousins, who showed up every year in new clothes to eat food they had not cooked. He called Calvin because Bernard Caldwell was 81 years old and had spent a lifetime studying people, and he had seen something in his niece's quiet husband that no one else in the family had bothered to look for. They met at Bernard's office at 7 in the morning before the staff arrived. Bernard laid it out without apology: the liability gap, the regulatory timeline, the 3 weeks he estimated before the situation became uncontainable. He slid a folder across the desk and watched Calvin read it. Calvin read every page. Then he asked 3 questions, precise and technical, about the firm's bond counterparty structure. Bernard answered each one. Calvin closed the folder and sat quietly for a moment, and then he told Bernard what he could do. The arrangement was structured over the following 2 weeks through a Reese Capital subsidiary, a Delaware-registered entity called Meridian Bond Partners, which existed on paper as a mid-sized infrastructure bond issuer with no public profile and no visible connection to Calvin Reese or anything he had built. Meridian injected $4.7 billion into Caldwell Financial's portfolio through a bond instrument agreement that was legal, ironclad, and invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. In exchange, Meridian became Caldwell Financial's primary bond counterparty, generating 61% of the firm's total revenue on a rolling quarterly basis. The firm did not just survive. It flourished. Bernard shook Calvin's hand the day the agreement was finalized and said, "I am going to tell them one day. When the time is right, I am going to tell them who saved this." Calvin told him there was no rush. Bernard nodded and said he would handle it. 4 months later, Bernard Caldwell died of a stroke at his desk on a Wednesday afternoon in October. He died with his reading glasses on and a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he took the origin of the rescue arrangement with him to his grave. The only things that remained were the documents. Terence Caldwell stepped into the chief executive role within 30 days, moving with a speed that suggested he had been waiting. He redecorated Bernard's office, promoted 2 of his own people, and gave himself a salary of $1.2 million annually, which he announced at a family dinner as a reflection of the firm's strength under new leadership. He credited the firm's financial recovery, which he had watched happen from a distance without understanding its mechanism, entirely to market conditions and his own strategic vision. He bought the Bentley Continental in the spring of 2017. The lake house in Tunica came the following year. Phyllis received her $40,000 monthly distribution without interruption and spent it the way she had always spent Caldwell money, on the estate's maintenance, on travel, on the particular pleasures of a woman who had decided long ago that comfort was her inheritance. She had raised Terence to run the firm and Jasmine to marry well, and in her accounting, one of those investments had paid off. Jasmine watched her brother's success accumulate and felt the contrast with her own husband like a slow, grinding pressure behind her sternum. Every new thing Terence acquired was a new data point in an argument she was always running in her head. The argument that she had chosen wrong, that she had settled, that the man sitting across from her at dinner with his quiet face and his unremarkable clothes was the reason her life looked the way it did, instead of the way it should. She handled it by making him smaller. She told her book club he handled taxes for small businesses. She told her sorority sisters he did freelance accounting. She told anyone who asked, and several people who did not, that Calvin was a nice man who was simply not ambitious. She built an entire social identity around his invisibility because his invisibility was the only story that made her choices feel like choices rather than mistakes. And meanwhile, the man she was erasing had been quietly funding every dollar of the empire she bragged about at those same gatherings, not out of generosity, not out of love, but because a dying old man had asked him to, and Calvin Rees did not walk away from his word. The Caldwell family had spent 6 years living lavishly off yield, generated by a man they openly despised. They had no idea. And 3 days after sweet tea dried on Calvin's collar, that arrangement was about to change in ways none of them had the imagination to anticipate. 3 days after the reunion, Calvin Rees drove downtown. Not to the satellite office in East Memphis that Jasmine believed was a small consulting space. Not to any address he had ever mentioned at home. He drove to the tower on 2nd Avenue, parked in the structure beneath it, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The floor that bore no company name in the lobby directory, no signage on the frosted glass doors, no indication of what lay behind them to anyone who did not already know. 200 people worked on that floor. They called him Mr. R. Margaret Osei was waiting for him when he stepped off the elevator, the way she always was, standing rather than sitting, a leather portfolio in her left hand, her expression carrying the particular, calibrated neutrality of a woman who has learned to let Calvin set the temperature of every room before she adjusts to it. She had worked beside him for 11 years. She knew every subsidiary, every instrument, every filing in every state. She also knew about the reunions, about Jasmine, about the way Calvin came to work on Monday mornings after holiday weekends with a stillness that was not peace. She had never once asked him about it. She did not ask now. She simply said, "Conference room," and led the way. Calvin sat at the head of the table and placed his hands flat on the surface and said, "I need a full legal audit. Every Caldwell financial document connected to the Meridian bond arrangement, every page Bernard signed. I want to know exactly what we hold and exactly what it means." Margaret opened the portfolio. She had anticipated the request. She had, in fact, been anticipating it for 8 years with the quiet patience of someone who has prepared a document they hope they will never need to use. The original 2016 agreement was 43 pages. Bernard Caldwell's signature appeared on 11 of them, notarized on each occasion, witnessed by 2 independent attorneys, whose names and bar numbers were documented in the appendix. The instrument was filed correctly in Delaware, cross-referenced in Wyoming, and structured through 3 layers of subsidiary architecture that made Meridian bond partners invisible to any surface-level search of Rees Capital infrastructure. It was, Margaret said, the most airtight bond counterparty agreement she had seen in 20 years of practice. Calvin listened without expression. Then he asked the question he had been turning over since he stood in that bathroom mirror 3 days ago with sweet tea drying on his collar. How long does Caldwell Financial survive if Meridian stops renewing at the next quarterly rollover? Margaret did not hesitate. 11 weeks, she said. At current burn rate, with the liability structure they are carrying, they cannot meet client obligations past 11 weeks without replacement capital. And replacement capital at this scale, on this timeline, is not something they can source quietly. 11 weeks. Calvin nodded once. Then Margaret set a second document on the table, and her expression shifted by precisely 1 degree, enough for Calvin to notice. She had found something in the audit that was not in the original agreement, something that had happened after Bernard died. Terence Caldwell had been telling Caldwell Financial's institutional clients, in pitch meetings, in quarterly reviews, in written correspondence, that the Meridian bond relationship was, in his exact documented words, proprietary Caldwell infrastructure. He had been representing the instruments, the yield, and the counterparty relationship as products of his own strategic development. He had been taking credit, in writing, for a structure that Calvin had built, and Bernard had agreed to keep silent. Calvin read the documents Margaret had pulled. He read them the way he read everything. Slowly, completely, without visible reaction. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at the far wall for a long moment. The slow burn was over. He had spent 8 years absorbing the Caldwell family's contempt. The cutting remarks, the public dismissals, the accumulated 1,000 small cruelties of a family that had decided he was nothing and had never once checked their assumption against the facts. He had stayed quiet, not from weakness, but from the particular discipline of a man who was raised to believe that patience was not the absence of strength. It was the fullest expression of it. But Terence had taken credit for his work. That was the line. Calvin turned back to Margaret and said, "I need you to prepare 2 documents." She picked up her pen. "The first is a Meridian non-renewal notice, standard contractual language, no names, no explanation, effective at the next quarterly rollover. The second is a divorce filing, Memphis jurisdiction," Margaret wrote without looking up. When she finished, she looked at him across the table with the composed expression of someone who has one remaining professional obligation before proceeding. "Calvin," she said, "are you sure?" He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Bernard always said the documents would speak for themselves," he said. Margaret closed the portfolio. She did not ask again. She did not editorialize. She did not offer the kind of consolation that would have reduced what was happening to something smaller than it was. She simply stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked to the door with the steady efficiency of a woman who has been waiting 11 years to make 2 very specific phone calls. Calvin stayed at the table a moment longer. He thought about Bernard, about that early morning meeting in 2016, the folder across the desk, the handshake at the end. He thought about a man who had believed in him when no one in that family was paying enough attention to see who he actually was. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and got back to work. He did not move impulsively. He did not act from anger. He spent the next 72 hours building something so precise, so surgical, so legally immovable that when it landed there would be nothing left to argue about. Just the documents, speaking for themselves. Calvin came in on Thursday morning with a whiteboard marker and no wasted words. Margaret was already there. She had cleared the large conference room table and set out the Caldwell financial files in chronological order, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation. Everything in its place, everything within reach, nothing that was not going to be used. She had also, without being asked, prepared a separate folder for David Park, who arrived at 9 o'clock exactly in a charcoal suit with a slim briefcase and the unhurried energy of a man who has been waiting for this particular call for 12 years. David Park had drafted Calvin's prenuptial agreement in the spring of 2012, 6 weeks before the wedding, at Calvin's specific and private request. He had done it carefully, thoroughly, and without asking Calvin why a man about to marry someone he loved needed 63 pages of asset protection documentation. He had understood, professionally, that some clients build structures before they know they will need them. He had filed it, stored it, and billed Calvin for 12 hours of work that Jasmine's attorney had reviewed and dismissed as standard boilerplate. That attorney had not been wrong that it was standard. He had simply failed to understand what standard, in Calvin's hands, actually meant. David set the prenuptial agreement on the table and walked through it, clause by clause. Reese Capital Infrastructure and all its subsidiaries, including Meridian Bond Partners and every instrument held beneath them, were explicitly excluded from the marital estate under Section 4, Article 2, with language so precise that it cited the Delaware filing date, the registered trade name, and the specific class of assets covered. Jasmine had signed it on page 61. Her initials appeared on pages 12, 29, 44, and 57. Her attorney's signature of review appeared on the cover page. She had never read past page 3. David said this not with satisfaction, but with the neutral precision of a man citing a documented fact. Calvin nodded and moved on. The plan took shape on the whiteboard in 4 columns. Margaret handled the meridian sequence. David handled the divorce architecture. The columns were connected by arrows indicating timing, and the timing was everything. The meridian non-renewal notice would go out on Monday morning. It was a single page drafted in the language of routine contract administration. No names, no explanation, no emotional content of any kind. It cited the relevant clause numbers from the 2016 agreement, stated that Meridian bond partners would not be renewing the quarterly bond instruments upon their next rollover date, and closed with a standard courtesy line. It was the most devastating document Calvin had ever signed, and it read like a form letter. The divorce filing would be served the same Monday morning. Memphis jurisdiction was deliberate. It removed any possibility of Jasmine leveraging the Caldwell family's preferred attorneys in Germantown, who knew the family's financial landscape and might have found angles that a Memphis family law judge would never allow. David had already prepared the filing. It cited irreconcilable differences, referenced the prenuptial agreement by clause and page number, and made no claim on Reese Capital or any of its subsidiaries because there was no legal mechanism by which any claim could have succeeded. Jasmine was going to receive both pieces of news on the same Monday afternoon. Calvin looked at the whiteboard for a long moment when the columns were complete. Then he picked up the marker and drew a single arrow connecting both columns to a third, the journalist. Denise Hollis had been covering infrastructure finance at the Memphis Business Journal for 11 years. She had written 3 separate pieces on anonymous infrastructure firms over the past 4 years, 2 of which had been about Reese Capital subsidiaries without knowing the parent company's name. She was meticulous, fair, and entirely capable of tracing Meridian Bond Partners to its Delaware parent if someone pointed her at the right corporate registry documents. Calvin had been her anonymous source on those earlier pieces. She answered on the second ring when he called Friday afternoon. He said, "Denise, it is Calvin Reese. You can publish the founder's name now." There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Calvin Reese of Memphis, Tennessee." "Yes," he said. Another pause, shorter. "I will need 48 hours to build the full story correctly." "Take what you need," he said. "The Caldwell financial dependency is part of the public record if you know where to look. The 2016 agreement is filed in Delaware under Meridian Bond Partners. The parent company traces straight forward from there." He gave her nothing else. He did not need to. Denise Hollis was the kind of journalist who did not need a map once someone showed her the door. He hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of his office. By Friday evening, David Park had submitted 4 filings. By Saturday morning, Denise Hollis had confirmed the Delaware corporate registry trail and had a draft story ready to hold until the bond notice landed on Monday. By Saturday afternoon, every moving part was in position. Calvin drove home at 4 o'clock. He cooked dinner, red beans and rice, the way his mother made it, low and slow on the back burner with a smoked turkey neck and a bay leaf. He watched a game. He called his mother and talked to her for 20 minutes about nothing important. He went to bed at 10 o'clock. He slept without difficulty. By Saturday night, 4 legal documents had been filed, 1 journalist had a story ready to publish, and not a single Caldwell had any idea what Monday morning was going to feel like. The letter was already in the mail. The letter arrived at Caldwell Financial Group's East Memphis headquarters on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock, tucked inside a standard business envelope with a Delaware return address. The CFO, a careful man named Gerald Webb, who had been with the firm for 14 years, opened it with his usual Monday efficiency. He read it once. Then he read it again, more slowly. The way you read something when the words are clear, but the meaning is impossible. It was a single page, routine language. Meridian bond partners would not be renewing Caldwell Financial's quarterly bond instruments at the upcoming rollover date. The decision was final. No explanation was given. A standard courtesy line closed the letter. Gerald called Meridian's office within 10 minutes. The woman who answered was polite and immovable. The decision had been made at the parent company level. It was not subject to review or negotiation. She wished him a good day and ended the call. Gerald sat with the letter for 90 minutes before he called Terence. Terence was dismissive for the first 5 minutes of the call. Then he was angry for the next 10. By the time Gerald walked him through the revenue mathematics, 61% of total firm yield, $1.4 billion in bond instruments gone at rollover. Terence was something Gerald had never seen him be before. He was frightened. Terence made 3 calls in the hour that followed to contacts across the financial community who he believed could tell him who actually owned Meridian Bond Partners. None of them could. The Delaware Corporate Registry listed a registered agent firm and a suite number. Every subsidiary trail dead-ended at another shell. The structure held like a wall with no doors. He could not find the name. He did not know the name was Calvin Reese. At 2:30, that same Monday afternoon, across town, a process server walked into the offices of Jasmine Reese Caldwell's real estate firm on Poplar Avenue and handed her an envelope. She opened it at her desk. The divorce filing was 12 pages. The prenuptial agreement was 63. Jasmine turned to page 3 of the prenuptial agreement and stopped. She turned to page 12. She turned to page 29. She sat very still at her desk for 4 minutes, then called Calvin's number. No answer. She called again. No answer. A third time. A fourth. She called Phyllis. Phyllis arrived at the office 40 minutes later in her cream linen jacket, reading glasses already on, prepared to be outraged. She took the prenuptial agreement from Jasmine's desk and began reading from the beginning. She read for 11 minutes without speaking. The outrage on her face shifted, degree by degree, into something that looked like the first cold draft of real fear. "What does this mean?" Jasmine asked. Phyllis set the document down carefully. "It means," she said, "that there is nothing to reach." Tuesday morning, Gerald Webb presented the revenue model to Terence behind closed doors. Without the Meridian bond instruments renewing, Caldwell Financial's flagship fund would drop 34% in projected yield by end of quarter. The firm could not cover its client obligations without immediate replacement capital. Gerald's number for what they needed was $220 million minimum, sourced within 8 weeks. Terence called 4 emergency board members before noon. The board meeting was set for Thursday. The Thursday meeting lasted 3 hours. 2 outside attorneys reviewed the 2016 Meridian agreement line by line. They confirmed what Gerald had already concluded. The contract was unbreakable. Every termination clause, every renewal mechanism, every exit provision, all of them were drafted in Meridian's favor. Caldwell Financial had signed an agreement that gave the counterparty complete discretion to exit at any quarterly interval with standard notice. Bernard had known exactly what he was signing. Terence slammed his hand on the conference table and told the room he wanted to know who owned Meridian. He said it loudly, the way a man speaks when he has run out of other options. One of the outside attorneys told him the Delaware Registry was the starting point and that tracing the parent company could take weeks. Terence said he did not have weeks. He did not know how right he was. By the end of week 2, Terence had burned through every contact he trusted, had come up with 0 answers on Meridian's ownership, had no replacement capital in sight, and had a board that was beginning to ask questions he could not answer. Jasmine had stopped going into her office. Phyllis had stopped taking calls from the extended family members who had started hearing rumors at their hair appointments and their church auxiliaries. Calvin, meanwhile, had been at his desk on the 14th floor every morning at 8. He received one brief update from Margaret each day. He responded to each one with a single word: confirmed. He did not gloat, he did not celebrate. He simply worked the way he had always worked, while the structure he had built, patient, precise, and legally immovable, did exactly what he had designed it to do. 9 weeks left on the clock. And then Denise Hollis's story published, and the Caldwells learned everything at once, the same way the rest of Memphis did, over their morning coffee in the bright light of a Wednesday, with no warning and no time to prepare. The Memphis Business Journal published at 6 o'clock Wednesday morning. The headline read, "Who is Calvin Reese, the $5.3 trillion man Memphis never knew?" By 7, the story was the most read article in the publication's 30-year history. By 8, it had been picked up by 3 national financial wire services. By 9, it was on the front page of every major business news platform in the country. The story had everything: the founding, the Delaware filing, the 14 years of silence, the Meridian Bond Partners subsidiary, the dependency, 61% of Caldwell Financial's total revenue, 6 years of distributions, 1 Bentley, 1 lake house in Tunica, all of it flowing from a firm whose founder had been called a nobody accountant at a family cookout 3 weeks prior. And then there was the video. Someone at the reunion had recorded the sweet tea moment on their phone and posted it to a private Facebook group for family. It had been circulating quietly for 3 weeks, getting occasional comments from cousins who found it funny. The morning the journal story published, a financial journalist in Chicago found it, clipped it, and posted it to his platform with a single caption: "This is the woman who threw tea on the man who built a $5 trillion infrastructure empire. Watch her face." It went everywhere, fast. Jasmine's face was fully visible. Her name was in the caption within 4 hours. By noon Wednesday, her employer, a regional real estate development firm on Poplar Avenue, had placed her on administrative leave, citing reputational review, pending further assessment. The email reached her personal phone while she was sitting in her car in a parking garage, unable to go inside. She read it twice, then she called Terence. Terence did not answer. Phyllis saw the story at 8 that morning and called Terence immediately. He told her he was handling it. She called back at 10. He told her again he was handling it. She drove to his office at noon and walked past his assistant and stood in his doorway and asked him, in the voice she used when she was not asking a question, exactly what her $40,000 a month was doing. He had no answer. She turned and walked out. The institutional clients moved the same day the story published. 3 of them, a pension fund administrator, a hospital system endowment, and a regional university foundation, submitted formal transfer notices representing $900 million in combined assets under management. The notices arrived at Caldwell Financial's compliance office within 72 hours of the journal going live. Gerald Webb put them on Terence's desk in a single stack and did not say anything. The bank called Thursday. Caldwell Financial's $220 million credit facility, extended against the firm's asset base, was frozen pending an emergency audit. The bank's risk team had been monitoring the transfer volume. The Meridian story had confirmed what the volume already suggested. They cited standard risk management protocol. They were polite about it. It did not matter. Terence spent Thursday afternoon calling every private equity contact he had in Nashville and Atlanta. He called 4 firms. He laid out the situation with the composure of a man who has practiced staying calm while drowning. All 4 firms declined within 24 hours. What Terence did not know, what he could not have known, was that all 4 firms held minority investment positions in Reese Capital Infrastructure. They had been notified of the Caldwell situation by Margaret Osey's office the previous week as a routine disclosure to minority stakeholders. Each firm called Calvin directly after declining Terence's request. Calvin received each call at his desk on the 14th floor. He responded to each one with a text message. Noted, Week 5 brought the Tennessee Department of Commerce. The audit was triggered automatically by the volume of client transfer requests, a regulatory threshold that kicked in when transfers exceeded 15% of a firm's total AUM within a 30-day window. The examiners arrived at Caldwell Financial's East Memphis headquarters on a Tuesday morning with standard documentation requests. Within 3 days, they had flagged the Meridian dependency. 6 years of yield drawn from a single, undisclosed counterparty, never disclosed to clients as a concentration risk, never reported to regulators as a material relationship. It was a compliance failure, a serious one. Terence's personal assets were frozen Friday afternoon pending the securities investigation. The lake house in Tunica, the Bentley, the Nashville restaurant stake, all of it locked pending resolution of an investigation that Terence's own attorney told him quietly would take no less than 18 months. Calvin heard about the asset freeze from Margaret, who mentioned it at the end of their daily briefing in one sentence, the way you mention weather. He nodded and moved on to the next item. That same Friday evening, his phone rang with a number he recognized. Dorothy Caldwell, 78 years old, the only person in that yard who had seen what was on his phone screen at the reunion. He answered. She said, "I saw that email subject line at the reunion, Calvin. I have been waiting." He said, "I know, Miss Dorothy." There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Jasmine wants to meet with you one time. She asked me to ask." Calvin was quiet for a moment. "Tell her Bernard's old office," he said. "Saturday morning, 1 hour, no attorneys." By the end of week 5, the Caldwell name, the name Jasmine had hyphenated her entire identity around, the name Phyllis had spent decades polishing like silverware, was the most toxic 2 syllables in Memphis business circles. And Calvin Reese, the invisible man, the nobody accountant, had 1 hour left to say everything he had never needed to say before. Calvin arrived at the Caldwell Financial Building at 8:45 on a Saturday morning, 15 minutes before the agreed time, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where Bernard's original corner office sat empty and unchanged since the day Bernard had died at his desk. The office still smelled faintly of Bernard, old leather and cedar, and something that might have been the particular cologne of a man who took himself seriously. The desk was still there, a wide mahogany piece that Bernard had purchased in 1994 and refused to replace. The chair behind it was Bernard's chair, high-backed, dark brown, with the slow creak of something that had held a lot of weight over a lot of years. Calvin sat in it. He placed the folder he had brought with him, the original 2016 agreement, 43 pages, Bernard's signature on 11 of them, in the center of the desk. Then he folded his hands, and he waited. Jasmine arrived at 9 o'clock with Phyllis behind her, which Calvin had not been told, but had fully expected. He looked at them both when they came through the door, and said nothing except, "Close it behind you." Phyllis sat in one of the 2 chairs across the desk without being invited. Jasmine remained standing for a moment, looking at Calvin in Bernard's chair with an expression that moved rapidly through several stages before settling on something that was not quite outrage, and not quite grief, and not quite anything she had a name for. She sat down. Terence arrived 4 minutes later, uninvited, and breathing like a man who had been rehearsing something in the car. He took a position near the wall rather than sit, which was its own kind of statement. Calvin glanced at him once and then looked back at Jasmine. He let her go first. She went for 6 minutes without interruption. She said he had hidden things. She said he had deceived her. She said that a husband who builds something that large and says nothing to his wife is not a husband. He is a stranger, wearing a husband's clothes, and she had a right to be angry, and she was angry, and everyone in that room was going to understand exactly how angry she was. Calvin listened to every word. He did not shift in his chair. He did not look away. He did not offer the kind of expression that invites argument or further escalation. He simply received it, the way he had received every cutting remark, every dismissal, every performance at every reunion and dinner table and social gathering for 8 years. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Calvin leaned forward slightly and began to speak. He started in 2009, the spare bedroom, the $200,000, the Delaware filing under a registered trade name. He spoke slowly and precisely, the way a man speaks when he is not trying to convince anyone of anything because the documents in the folder are already doing that work for him. He described the first Arkansas contract, the years of reinvestment, the moment the firm crossed $10 billion in managed assets. He described opening the East Memphis office and telling her it was a small consulting space. He looked at her when he said that. She had not asked. He described the 2016 call from Bernard. He described the morning they met in this office at this desk with a folder not unlike the one sitting in front of her now. He described the 43 pages Bernard signed and the 4 months Bernard lived after that, and the decision Bernard had made to take the origin of the rescue arrangement to his grave. He slid the folder across the desk. Jasmine looked at it, but did not open it. Phyllis reached across and opened it herself, turned to the first page, and the color left her face like water draining from a glass. Calvin looked at Jasmine and said what he had come to say. "You threw sweet tea in my face in front of 40 people and told me I would never be in your league. You said it like it was the truest thing you had ever said, and you believed it." He paused. "But what you did not know was that the bonds your brother built his entire career around, the ones he sold to every client, the ones that paid for your mother's $40,000 a month, the ones that bought the Bentley and the lake house, and every vacation your family called Caldwell money. Every dollar of yield on every one of those bonds came from a company I built with my own hands, from nothing, in a spare bedroom in Orange Mound, while you were telling your book club one did taxes for small businesses." The room held the silence like a held breath. "You did not marry down, Jasmine. You married the foundation, and I am pulling it out." Terence pushed off the wall and started to say something about the Tennessee investigation, about the audit findings, about the fact that this was all still in question legally and that Calvin should not think. Calvin turned to him with the calm expression of a man who has already read the ending of a book. "Terence," he said, "your personal assets are frozen and your attorney has told you privately that the investigation will take 18 months minimum. I would sit down." Terence sat down. Phyllis was crying, not the crying of remorse, the crying of a woman who has just understood, for the first time and completely, that the life she has been living for 6 years was built on a foundation that belongs to someone else, and that foundation is leaving. Jasmine said very quietly, "What do you want, Calvin? What is it you actually want from us?" Calvin considered the question as though it deserved real thought. Then he said, "Nothing. There is nothing in this room I want." He stood. He straightened his jacket with both hands, smoothing the lapels the way his father had taught him, slowly, from the center, outward. He picked up the folder and left the original 2016 agreement on the desk in its place because they had a right to read it, and because Bernard would have wanted the documents to be where the documents belonged. He thanked them for meeting with him. Then he walked out of Bernard Caldwell's office and down the hallway and into the elevator and out through the lobby into the Memphis morning, and he did not look back once. Behind him, in the corner office that smelled like cedar and old leather, 3 members of the Caldwell family sat in silence around a mahogany desk with 43 pages of the truth between them and absolutely nothing left to say. 6 months later, Memphis would look entirely different depending on which name you carried. 6 months after Calvin Reese walked out of Bernard Caldwell's office without looking back, the Tennessee court system finished what the documents had started. Caldwell Financial Group was dissolved by court order on a Tuesday morning in January, the result of the Tennessee Department of Commerce investigation findings and a securities compliance failure that Terrence's attorneys had spent 4 months trying to argue down to a lesser charge. They did not succeed. The firm that Bernard had built over 30 years that Terrence had claimed as his inheritance and his identity ceased to exist as a legal entity before noon on a weekday, with no ceremony and no press release. Terrence accepted a consent decree. He was banned from the financial services industry for 12 years. His personal assets, the Bentley, the lake house in Tunica, the Nashville restaurant stake, the investment accounts that had grown fat on 6 years of Meridian bond yield, were partially liquidated to satisfy the firm's client obligations. What remained after that process was considerably less than what Terrence had spent a decade telling people he was worth. He moved into a rental property in Cordova and did not give interviews. Jasmine's divorce was finalized in the same month. The prenuptial agreement held exactly as David Park had built it to hold, airtight, clause by clause, page by page. She received nothing from Reese Capital Infrastructure, nothing from any of its subsidiaries, and nothing from the 14 years of work that had happened in the same city she lived in while she told people her husband did taxes. The court proceedings were brief because there was nothing to contest. The prenuptial agreement had anticipated every argument her attorneys raised and answered each one in advance. She returned to her family name, Caldwell, the name her mother had spent decades polishing, the name she had hyphenated onto her own because she believed it opened doors. In January of that year, in Memphis, Tennessee, the Caldwell name did not open a single door it had not already closed. Phyllis left the Germantown estate in November, 2 months before the court finalized the dissolution. The estate went to auction and sold for $2.1 million, which covered the remaining obligations and left nothing for the family. She moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Collierville, the kind of address that would have made her physically uncomfortable to say out loud 5 years before. She did not call Jasmine for 3 weeks after the move. When she finally did, neither of them had much to say. Calvin, meanwhile, was doing what Calvin had always done. He was building something. In October, 6 weeks after the confrontation in Bernard's office, he filed the paperwork for the Alara May Reese Foundation, named after his grandmother, a woman who had raised 5 children on a domestic worker's wages in Orange Mound and taught every one of them that dignity was not something you were given, it was something you maintained. The foundation's mandate was financial literacy. Its reach covered Orange Mound and 3 surrounding Memphis neighborhoods, the kind of communities that never saw infrastructure money, never saw investment capital, never saw the inside of a finance office that wasn't trying to take something from them. Calvin converted his parents' house on Delmar Avenue into the foundation's community office. He did not tear it down or renovate it beyond what was functional. He kept the kitchen where his mother had refilled his coffee the morning He laid out his plan on a yellow legal pad. He kept the gospel station programmed into the old radio on the counter. He put new chairs in what had been the living room and hired 3 full-time financial counselors from the neighborhood. On the day of the ribbon cutting, Ruth Reese held the scissors. Clifton stood beside her with his hands folded and his chin up, the way he had stood at every moment of consequence in his son's life. A small crowd gathered on Delmar Avenue, neighbors, former classmates, a few city officials who had quietly been doing business with Reese Capital for years and wanted to finally put a face to the name. Calvin stood in the back and watched his mother cut the ribbon. He did not make a speech. The following week, he called Margaret Osei into his office on the 14th floor and told her that effective the first of the year, her title was President of Reese Capital Infrastructure. Margaret accepted with the same expression she brought to everything, composed, direct, and without unnecessary words. She said she would need 2 weeks to restructure her current responsibilities. Calvin said that was fine. She thanked him. He told her Bernard would have liked her. She said she knew. It was at the Foundation's first public community event, held on a Saturday morning in December in the parking lot of a rec center on Park Avenue, that Calvin met Simone Garrett. She was introduced to him by a mutual contact as the executive director of Memphis Community Forward, a workforce development non-profit that had been operating in South Memphis for 11 years without enough funding and too much need. She was warm without performing warmth. She looked at him the way people look at someone they are actually curious about, rather than someone they are evaluating. She said she had never heard of Reese Capital Infrastructure. She said it without apology or embarrassment, the way you say a true thing that happens to be a relief to hear. Calvin laughed, a real one, quiet and genuine, and said that was probably the nicest thing anyone had said to him in months. They talked for 40 minutes, about the foundation, about her work, about Orange Mound and South Memphis, and what it meant to build something in the city you grew up in. When the event ended and the crowd began to thin, Calvin asked for her number. She gave it to him without hesitation and without making it a moment larger than it was. He drove home that evening in the 2011 Honda Accord, down the same streets he had driven for 30 years, past the grocery store where his mother still shopped, past the church where he had met Jasmine at a fundraiser 12 years ago, in another life. He drove in silence and thought about what his mother had told him once, sitting at that kitchen table on Delmar Avenue when he was 26 years old and full of a plan he had not yet told anyone. She had said, "The most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing to prove and everything already built." He had written it on the yellow legal pad that morning. He had never needed to write it anywhere since. It had lived in him the way the truest things live, quietly, completely, without announcement. Calvin Reese had been that person for 14 years. The room had just finally figured it out. Now, if this story moved something in you, if you believe that patience is a power that the world consistently underestimates, then hit that like button right now and let the algorithm know this kind of story deserves to be heard. If you are new here, subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done in Calvin's position? Would you have stayed as quiet as long as he did, or would you have spoken up sooner? Drop your answer below and drop your city while you're at it, because this community is everywhere and I want to know where you are watching from. If this story meant something to you, one more like before you go. It costs you nothing. And it means everything to this channel. I will see you in the next one.